Your leadership has to see your analysis in a way that they feel like they can be influenced and participate in it. You cannot come to the table with a black box analysis that's full of complex mathematics that nobody can understand and nobody can see the key decision points off of.
Welcome to Create New Futures, thought-provoking conversations with leaders, experts, and interesting minds. Join us as we explore ideas and reflect on practices that you can use and apply to create and shape the future. With your host, author and strategy consultant, Aviv Shahar.
Welcome to Create New Futures, where we develop conversations with successful leaders to explore how you can create a new future for you and for your organization. This is Aviv, and today I'm speaking with Joe Antons, director at Cisco, overseeing central revenue planning. Joe started at Cisco as intern, and many roles, and more than 2 decades later, he is thriving at Cisco. I initially met Joe in a series of leadership events I led with several Cisco teams. He brings a unique combination of analytical rigor and business acumen together with a huge, big heart for people. Joe, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Aviv.
Well, let's dive right in, and let me first ask you, what did I miss in this introduction?
I think you captured pretty well my history here. It's for me, the last couple decades working in the Valley has been really interesting, and my path has not been one of the technology itself so much as the analysis and sitting within the supply chain domain. And over those 2 decades, I've gotten to participate in an exciting company and see sort of its lifespan from beginning to where we're at now, as we went from an immature company to a very mature company in both our processes, our technology, and our place within the ecosystem within the Valley. So it's been an amazing run for myself.
So let's take it right there and ask you, compare where we are today, 2019, and compare that to, say, 2 decades ago. How is the Silicon Valley different today?
It's different in so many structural ways that don't touch directly on my work per se, in that it's a much more global, extension beyond the Valley itself into the world domain, the talent domain globally. The technology has changed a situation where it's 24/7 availability, and teams are very cross-functional and dynamic. 20 years ago, you could listen to startups where people are talking in restaurants and discussing what they're doing, and there's a lot of energy there. And a lot of that has moved into the network and into discussions across WebEx technologies, as an example, where teams are really integrated, but they're integrated in a way that's sort of a virtual coffee shop. I think that's been a really important part of the transition. It's changed the nature of the way teams are formed, the way we sort of grow and develop talent within the Valley itself. So I think that's been a really important transition. I think one of the things that's very different for me, I've sat in analytical roles for most of my career. And early on, as you're joining and thinking about where we were at in the 90s, where we were really looking at data availability, how to get data sets where they could be in the hands of the analysts. Analysts could work within the domain of Excel. They could sit down and process data and try to run trends, get some basic sense of what data looks like over time. What does your revenue look like? Who are you selling to? How much is going out the back door? Where are your inventory positions? Those types of analysis that you would do. And it was a lot of time series with maybe a little bit of statistical analysis done on top of it. As we progressed over time, within the first 10 years, we began to think of things in terms of single sources of truth. There were conflicts that would occur where I might be running a set of data, another individual runs a set of data, and questions of metadata started to introduce themselves. When did you take this snapshot? What hierarchy did you use, or what adjustments might you have applied as you thought about that data? What was your data source? What was the ETL that you ran across the data in order to transform it? And all of those questions were not core to the business itself, but they were essential to getting a question. Why did one analyst come with one answer and another come with another? I think those are really important domain transitions. And what's occurring now is we're beginning to transition even beyond SSOT conversations. I was in a review the other day where we were talking through our goals and objectives for the year, and we were talking about how to get our systems aligned to single sources of truth. And we realized we've gone beyond questions of metadata to what I would think of as more or less meta-analysis, and to begin to look at, instead of single sources of truth, single models of understanding.
Let's just slow this down a little bit and offer, please, a clear distinction of what you mean by metadata to meta-analysis.
Yeah, I think as we transitioned and we had a massive set of analysts beginning to run data and think about how a company was performing, we realized that the underlying data itself was disconnected or unstructured in a way that required you to think of those questions of metadata. So not just the data itself, but the conditions under which that data was created, what database it was stored under. If you have many, many different either ERP systems or data modules themselves, servers instances that you were carrying the data on, they might have been in conflict with each other and disagreed for reasons that were not necessarily related to what a business analyst would be concerned about, but reasons that were more structural within the data themselves. And a lot of the technology in the Valley was designed to think about speed of extraction, how to quickly create those data tables, how to do the underlying data design and architecture itself. That was a lot of the journey that was going on over the 10 years, I would say, in the 2000 to 2010 timeframe. Now, when you begin to think of things like meta-analysis, and I think this ties to a lot of the technology that the Valley is beginning to take a look at, there's information now that becomes about the business again that is not stored and archived and shareable. When I looked through, we had an internal discussion where we were talking about a demand signal. And when you begin to look beyond not just when was a signal created or what was the snapshot or what system was it created in, those metadata type questions, and you begin to look a little bit further into, I took it at a very simple level. If I was to say that I have thousands and thousands of product IDs, within an Excel table, and maybe 52 weeks of dates that I've supplied that I'm going to run that signal over, and I filled it with a bunch of numbers, that to me looks like a work product. But what's really important to think about is what that represents when you send it downstream and say, this is my demand signal. Because basic questions of, do you mean this is what you're going to book by week? Do you mean that this is what you're going to build? Is this what you're going to ship? As you begin to think about those questions of, is this the beginning of a week or the end of a week? And how are my partners going to use this downstream? Are they using this to negotiate? Are they trying to negotiate supplier agreements, long-term agreements? Are they trying to negotiate supply availability? Are they estimating build capacity, factory capacity? All those questions are quite complex. And you start off with a basic assumption that everyone knows what they're talking about, and you've just got to propagate the signal downstream and make sure that everyone's absorbing it. But it's actually quite complex, and the kind of information that you're sharing in that is dynamic, and it's best when it's an information exchange. I'm asking you for capacity, and you're confirming that you've gotten it for me.
Right.
Those kinds of questions require exchange, and that is a very complex thing to construct in tools and systems and processes. And I think that's really where we're at right now.
Yeah, great. And you took us all the way right to the deep end, first thing, which is great. Let me circle back to data in a minute, but actually take a step back and ask you may have already answered that question, but I'll ask it nevertheless. Of all the things you do at work, what do you enjoy the most?
When I think about what I do, in a lot of ways, it's like playing a game, and it's playing a game with a team that I really enjoy working with and developing, and I love that about what I do. And when I describe it as a game, what I think of is almost in any strategy game you're using. Think of chess as an example. You have resources, you have pieces, and you have a set of rules that you can apply. And you have a tension that exists between you and the outside world. In that case, it happens to be a competitive player. But in the world, it's all kinds of unknown variables that you're going to have to deal with and that are going to come at you. And what I love best about analysis, both in the supply chain environment and more broadly, is looking at the available resources, the available rules, and really thinking about what will the future look like and how will these different pieces play out. What challenges will we face, and how do we think about all our resources aligned in a strategically coherent way to achieve a goal? And I find that is a really complex thing to do. It's a hard thing to train people to do. It's a hard thing for a team to execute well. And I find that challenge very exciting.
Were you strategically approaching your career knowing that you wanted to stay in Cisco, in one company for such a long time? Because there are people who like the idea of having experiences in different companies, in different ecosystems. I've heard from people who describe the benefits of both sides of the equation. So give me your perspective. What are the benefits of working in the same company for many years? And what have you learned because you've been able to watch, as you said, Cisco evolve from an immature company to now a very mature company? Give me some comments on that.
It's funny. When I started, I remember John Chambers was the CEO at the time, and he had an all hands where he brought in everybody in, and we were discussing the quarter and where we were at and the vision for the future. And he asked that question. He said the average time span in the Valley in a company is 4 years. And he wanted a sense of how many people thought that they would finish their career at Cisco. This was still very early on in our life cycle. And for sure, I did not raise my hand. I was very early in my career, and I had no expectation of where I would be in the next 4 to 6 years. So it's funny for me now when I look 2 decades past, lots of hands went up in that room, and I would guess that many of them are no longer here. So it's a long and exciting journey for me to still be at the company. But if I looked at the advantages and why I stayed, so much of the growth that we had early on, there were emotional reasons to be connected to the company. We were like family, and we were achieving something amazing. We were truly connecting the world, and we had that sense that Chambers offered us of, having a place that we could create where we could change the way the world worked, lived, played, and learned. And it was an amazing time. There were a lot of close friendships, and there were definitely a lot of reasons to stay at the beginning. But as time went by, one of the things I find as a leader and that I've continually enjoyed is that my ability to imprint and change the company and its structure was really high, and it got higher as time went by. And one of the reasons for that, especially as you look at the world from an analytical perspective, is the most challenging thing about analytical work is you need to not only understand how the systems work, how to model the human system and interaction, but you need to know how to make that analysis become usable and absorbable by an organization. And almost any intelligence or analytical function can stall or bog down if the leaders themselves don't understand what they're hearing, and you don't know how to persuade them when what you're saying really matters and when everything is generally good. So that back and forth really requires a trust and an ability to know where the leverage points are in an organization. I think of it as the difference between in a brain, you can do all the thinking that you want, but if you don't have the spinal column that attaches you to the body, you don't really have the power to influence anything. Yeah. And that's a really important part of analysis.
Yes. So what would be an example of that sense of making an imprint and impacting such a large company, whether you can give a for instance of that, both in terms of something specific, if you can talk to that, but also then the feeling, the experience of how that lands with you?
Yeah, I'll try to use a generalizable example that won't be too specific. One of the challenges I had with the revenue planning operation I have early on, when I came in, our ability to understand what our factory capabilities were and what our output would be, given whatever the sales plan would be, was really important. And it was quite challenging for a lot of different reasons. And there's a need to be able to make and articulate a plan externally, but there's also a need to really be able to articulate the internal needs, both from a supply capability, from capacity perspective, and to look far into the future. To be able to look multiple years and at least have a firm grip on what's happening within a rolling years window. And the dynamics of understanding what that sales plan will look like and how it will materialize for a factory and the decisions that factory will need to make are really quite difficult. And it's easy at the beginning to simply be trend-based, to just try to look and try to assume some level of rate of growth and continue to acquire supplies and capacity and to estimate your capabilities based on that trend. But as it turns out, there's a lot of factors in the company, especially as you go through different business transitions as we have where we shift business models or you have changing conditions within the supply base itself. There are a lot of drivers to that. And one of the things that was really important early on is that we disconnect ourselves from the idea that a simple historical time series trend will tell you where your future is going,
Right.
that the past is perfectly predictive. And we needed the power to be able to begin to look at the underlying drivers. When did the customers want orders was a really important open question. What was our actual supply availability going to be in any given quarter? What were the mix of products going to be and what would that look like and what key constraints there are? Modeling that and beginning to break down those numbers beyond just a trend into what are the 5, 6 really important variables that are understandable by the organization, that can be modeled and truly predictive, and then can lead directly to a decision. Those were the key things. If I was going to end up with a bad result, could I change things now that would make that go away?
Right. So this is one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you, in that in the number of sessions where you participated with me, you impressed me in this unique ability to frame issues in a succinct way and anchor the conversation on data and on the business impact. And you now framed at the beginning of this discussion the idea of not just meta data, but meta analysis. So let's talk about this for a minute and again circle back to data, because it sounds obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And define for me, please, what is the ability or the competence to lead a data-guided, data-grounded conversation, and why is it so difficult for so many? Because there are only few managers who seem to be doing that very well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one as I think about the full range of things you really need to do to be successful in managing a data-driven conversation. And one of them that I think is really important is understanding that brain-to-body connection. Where are the leverage points in an organization? Where do things actually happen? What is the actual fulcrum within the organization where a decision is made? And how do you get to an understanding of where those handful, 5 or 6 decisions are made? So if I was to describe the more general environment of how to be competent, that one is your leadership has to see your analysis in a way that they feel like they can be influenced and participate in it. You cannot come to the table with a black box analysis that's full of complex mathematics that nobody can understand and nobody can see the key decision points off of. That's a really important challenge in the overall process of doing data analysis. You have to connect yourself to the actual decision-making process and the top of mind that the leadership itself would be in tune to. What are the sales rates of growth? What are the different business segments doing? How do you tie yourself to the external numbers and what that's going to look like? You have to be specific and precise with the numbers that they're facing in the business decisions that they're really responsible for, and then make the entire analysis look like a set of choices.
Right.
And I think that's extremely important. I think that the second piece of that is, again, that brain-to-body connection. You have to understand, once you've done that analysis and you've made that choice, it can't be disconnected from what actually happens then after the fact. Your analysis has to actually be generally accurate. And as I've walked through with teams, it also has to be accurate in showing the trade-offs. So an example is, if bookings or sales projections beat by 10%, your factory capacity needs to beat by 10%. If it misses by 10%, your factory capacity needs to miss by 10%. Those things have to be tied perfectly to show that the trade-offs were actually relevant. It can't be filled with buffer or fluff in the analysis that makes it look like the choices were actually irrelevant, that the outcome was going to happen anyway. And that requires both that you not pad your analysis and that your analysis be accurate, that you know the 6 or 7 choices that lead to the outcomes that you want. And then you can be precise and prescriptive on that. And that's actually quite difficult. It's also very important for an analyst to build currency by being transparent when the analysis has failed, and to be able to show where it broke and what you're doing to fix it. And that the tendency and the instinct is to be protective and to use explanation after the fact. And it actually destroys your currency as an analyst. You only have your facts and your ability to partner with transparency with your leadership in order to really build a good partnership.
So this is interesting because there is the cerebral, analytical, connecting the dots and bringing to the table business acumen, but then there is who you are as a person, who you are as a leader, and how do you preserve your currency by building that transparency that's never defensive of the data itself, but rather is as transparent as can be.
That's exactly.
The other thing in what you're describing, which I have seen to be fascinating, is that even in companies where for several years there has been a major effort to wire people into outcome-based thinking, I find that time and again people struggle to indeed ground their thinking in outcomes, or they do it superficially. And as a result, I've seen that people often mix inputs and outcomes and or confuse organizational outcomes for business outcomes. And the fact is that each of these three are important. I'd offer a quick definition to the three, and let's see if you propose any way to redefine these. I'd say that inputs are the resources that we allocate and the activities we generate to produce outcomes. And organizational outcomes are the results we produce internally in our own organization that enable us to sustainably meet our commitments to clients and to stakeholders. But then business outcomes include what we deliver to clients and the financial results, the market share results that we produce, and so on. So somehow the clarity of thought and the clarity of alignment and how these three interrelate, I find to be critical. But again, more often than not, when I ask people to describe what it is they do and what are the outcomes they hope to produce, they speak about these three interchangeably. This was one of those moments in more than one session where you stood up and, and you brought clarity to the conversation by actually delineating what was what.
Yeah, I think those three distinctions are really important, and I think there's probably some degree of an emotional reason why people tend to confuse them. I think everyone knows intuitively that they want to be focused on outcomes. That you want to be able to say, if I'm in a planning environment in a supply chain, I want to be able to commit to cost outcomes. I want to be able to commit to delivery outcomes for the customer. I want to deliver the revenue plan. I want to deliver high quality. Those are the kinds of things I know I should be grounded in. But what happens is in most organizational paradigms, the actual things you control are a subset of that. And most of the outcomes that you have to impact require a cross-functional relationship. And the desire to make commitments that you have any dependency on another group is really low. And the desire to commit to things you feel like you can actually control or with certainty attain, you just have an emotional connection to that as an organization. And it's hard to walk away from measuring yourselves on things you know how to do. And I think one of the challenges in being successful at being operating in a data analytical environment where you're actually making real and sincere commitments is that you frequently have to make commitments that tie you to other people. And you have to begin to think of yourselves, I think of it in algebraic terms, of the dependent and the independent variables. I know that I've got things that I have an independence on that I can execute, but I know that I have an extreme amount of dependency. And I have to get really good at calling that out, and calling out when I see a change in my environment, when a partner is falling down early in time enough to be able to react and change the direction. And that requires that I be really precise in my handoffs, that I build really good cross-functional relationships, that I build joint products in terms of analysis, and that we deliver joint products as a company. That's the hardest thing to do. And it's way easier in an analytical environment to stick with what you know you have competency at than it is to stretch yourself beyond that. And I think that's why the instinct is so high to obscure those three things.
That's a fascinating analysis of why these three are still so foggy. You're saying that they require such a high level of cross-functional collaboration and agreement, and you have to achieve. First of all, these are very difficult to achieve, and secondly, you'd have to surrender some of to large degree the control of those issues you're driving to achieve. Let me offer not a conflicting view of the issue, but from another angle that I think just tells the story in a different way, which is I'd say that there are three levels of consciousness in the workplace. The first is what I would call a structure focus. This is the mindset where people define who they are by their title. If they lead a certain function, that's who they are at work. The second focus is the work focus, not the structure focus. So this is the mindset where people define themselves by the activities that they're busy with every day and every week of the year. And the third is that holy grail we're talking about, which is the value focus, where the mindset is one where people define themselves by the value they contribute. And the way I look at the problem and the issue is we're largely still in large companies, even today, we're dealing with the hangover of the industrial mindset. In the industrial mindset, we were driven by that structure focus or even work focus. I was either my title or what it was that I was doing every day. And you're actually, in what you're describing, asking people to elevate to a whole different way of appreciating themselves and each other and the workflow. You're asking people to define themselves by the value, the outcomes they create. And what you're describing is that requires you to work cross-functionally and align and agree on a whole range of variables that only some of which you can control.
Yeah, I do think that's really important. When you look at it through that dimension of the way people define their role and they think about their role, even from an analytical perspective, your ability to be ingrained in a measuring process that you've already existed within and to call your job the same year in and year out is really high. It's hard to ask people to operate in the context of that centralized plan. So when you say when you were title-based and we have leadership defining objectives, there are aspects of that centralized leadership objective that have to be respected and understood. There's an aggregate strategy that you are executing to. When you look at the intermediate layers, though, what you can operate at a lower level of performance, which is just, I keep doing what I'm doing and I keep executing the instructions that I'm executing, and I allow all the strategy variation to occur at the most senior levels of the organization. But when you're operating in a what I would say an optimal way and a data-rich way, is when opportunities that are recognized at lower levels in the corporation but are still tethered to the aggregate goals are realized. Those teams have to be empowered to change and transform themselves dynamically. And what you have to do is, at the beginning and end of that, of the outcome that you're trying to deliver and at the leadership at the top end, the leadership has to make those outcomes so clear but so simple that everybody's on the same page and then is trained over and over again how to sort of deviate from the plan in order to achieve the objective. So if your focus is on making sure you've executed the instructions of the leadership, that's different than making your focus the execution of the outcome at the other end. And you have to know how to weight those correctly if you're sitting in the middle of that. If, however, you believe that the only thing you're supposed to do is execute measurements and keep doing what you were told, you miss opportunities and you don't optimize for the outcome at the other end. I actually think, when you talked about Cisco as a culture and one of the reasons to stay here, I think it's something we've been particularly effective at over the course of the years. And there's a part of me that thinks it came up through our environment of acquisitions and bolting teams on. There was a dynamic nature to team formation that was extremely important to our success. And so I continue to look to that example from earlier in my career, how you form teams, but how you train personnel as well. That you should look to deviate. You should look to deviate for optimal reasons. I've instructed multiple people in the past that if you want to be promoted, you need to look at me right now as I can see the thought forming on your head that you disagree with me, and be prepared to tell me that, and be prepared to tell me in the context of our plan why that's true. And it does require a lot of training and continuous reinforcement to a team that the goal is more important than the structure.
Right.
And you have to reorient the goal. You have to reorient the structure constantly to the goal.
You're also describing there a future state or a current state, if that is with your team, where there is a courageous culture and a culture that enables both ways. People have a line of sight to the outcome, but then in the reverse way, people are truly much more empowered to make decisions and drive an agenda that could be escalated all the way up because of the business impact that they realize can be created as a result of that change of strategy or change of even a decision that was already agreed to.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And for us, when we look at the analysis and we generate an analytical work product and we begin to look at trade-offs and how do I turn this into an algebraic equation? How do I turn it into trade-offs between different variables? What we do on that is, rather than having that just be work product that gets fed up and everybody checks the box that it was seen, we actually almost train on that data constantly. We look at the data, we look at what it's telling us, we ask questions of it, we say, what if this happens, or what if that happens? We're scenario modeling all the time. Because while we're having that conversation, it's designed from the most junior members to the most senior members of the team to have them see the trade-offs and the decisions that would be made, to get in the mind of the senior leadership of how this might appear to them and what personal motivation they may have that will be impacted by this. And to constantly go through that, so that when the team sees something, and all the time my team comes to me with analysis that's surprising, with insights that are not ones that obviously I have the time or the capability to generate on my own. I want the surprises all the time. I want the team to be able to look through whether it's the data structure or the metadata or the sources themselves or the analysis itself or how partner teams are reacting to it. They come with surprising conclusions all the time that later then become installed in the basic models in organizational relationships that we develop. And that's important. For me, that's the whole currency as a leader in an analytical environment is that your team itself produces insights. And the more that you can do it at a junior level, the more ROI you get out of your own people. You get surprise, and you get constant surprise at the most junior levels of the organization to the most senior. That's extremely rewarding, but it causes a lot more success in an analytical organization.
I can see why you're saying that you get up every morning and you go to work, but actually you're showing up to play a game. It certainly sounds like that.
Yeah, it is a little bit like that. I probably shaped my role to be a little bit that way.
Let's trace to the beginning of your journey. What inspired you when you were growing up?
Actually, it's funny as we talk about the games themselves. I think as a child, I really enjoyed. My father was in the military, and I spent a lot of time, in an environment where I would play strategy games and war games and progressions of resource deployment, multi-turn, multi-round environment and thinking ahead. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed the history that surrounded that. I enjoyed the strategy and the thought processes. And then at some point, my love of history merged with the love of economics. There was a book that I read, a series of books by Isaac Asimov that were around, it was a whole science fiction view of the world as mathematically predictable, and the ability to look at the history of the world as a system of equations and to think about how you might influence that. And as I went into college, that book and that thought process really stuck with me. And as I took calculus and economics, I began to see where all those ideas had come from, what was the origin of them. And it really connected for me and ultimately led to my career. And what I think of as demand and supply forecasting is really, extrapolations of economic theory. And it was a really exciting journey for me as something that was a hobby and something that I did in the background became the focal point of what my career would become later on. And my ability to shape my career into the kind of job that I would want around the things that were interesting to me. Just everything kind of unfolded in a way that was both intellectually and emotionally pleasing.
So let's slow down this one just a little bit, because I'm very interested in the journey of self-discovery in terms of where and how are you discovering what it is that you're good at, and at what point do you actually even tell yourself, yeah, I think this is this is what I'm here to do. I'm going to be doing this well. I'm going to excel here. Take me through this thought process. Is there a particular moment where you said, yeah, this is what I'm here to do?
There's a moment that sticks out in my head when I think of my career here, and then ultimately what led to my planning career. And it wasn't what I'd call a success. It was just a moment of insight. And there was a leader in our organization that at the time we had a particular metric that we were focused on sort of maniacally, which was whether we delivered on time to the commitments that we had made to our customers. And as a planner, I led that conversation within an extended cross-functional team, because the idea was that the plan I had loaded, if we executed to it, it should have yielded a pretty good performance. And if the plan was flawed, then there were reasons why that could break down. And so I found myself at a session one day where the leader, he stopped a presentation just before mine, and indicated, that we'd gone through this rigorous training on Pareto analysis and how to look at a time series trend, and to say that when there's 6 data points, they're stable, the system's in control. And he basically said that team just got up like every other team before it and presented to me results which are bad. And then that would have been okay. I consider the measurement of that okay. What I don't consider okay is that there was no analysis as to why it had failed and no plan to fix it. So the next person that gets up here and presents like that is going to have a problem. I was the next person up. I was very junior in my career, and I had no plan of attack. And I sat down and quickly wrote down 3 things that I thought I could do over the course of the next week and then the next month to work to correct my results. And as I did that, I found over time, over the next month, that I was actually able to correct the measurement. It was the first time it actually occurred to me that my job wasn't to just go through motions, to load a signal, to have that signal show up downstream, to explain after the fact what had happened. It was actually to anticipate and control those outcomes. And when I found that I actually could, it was exciting for me. It was a revelation, because I really enjoyed the math. I enjoyed the analysis. But the idea that something was being asked of me beyond that I actually be able to participate and control the outcomes of the company through my own insight, but more importantly, through my influencing and organizing of the thoughts of a cross-functional team, was amazing. And as I went forward on that journey and found more and more leadership opportunity in that domain, it was amazing. And it connected me back to many ideas, as I talked about the various different books you read and you go through different economic theory, but you start to read and understand that there's a community of people sharing around these ideas. And with my peers and the rest of the team, and as ideas were coming up in the Valley, and you're training in things like Apex and other, and just internal discussion on how to think about creating virtual min-maxes. I mean, just the constant idea sharing that was going on. I learned a lot, and I enjoyed the community. I enjoyed the leadership aspects. I enjoyed, turning systems of human behavior into analysis and outcomes. That was amazing.
That's a powerful story. That's what I call a life-centering, life-forming story. That moment where you face that challenge and you're able to find a way to address and meet that challenge. And as a result of that, it becomes a self-directing moment, because you're actually setting in motion your life, your professional career, your pattern of thought. That's powerful. That's beautiful. Who else would you say influenced you as a leader?
I've had a run of really good leadership throughout my time at Cisco. I've learned personally from at least a dozen different leaders on really a variety of things. I think that the analytical work, once that ignited in my head, I really, I found a lot of inspiration from peers and from reading itself. But I would say during most of my time at Cisco, what I was learning from my leadership as I evolved as a manager was how to be a servant leader. And in analysis, it's a really interesting thing because in a lot of ways, just like accounting or law or other functions, it's very hard to extract the work from the person. It isn't about resource investment or the size of a factory or the amount of fixed capital that you invest. It really is coming from the people themselves, and there's no way to develop tools that get around that. The analysis and the work product comes from them in the way it would any other partnership model. And the servant leadership that I learned from, and I could think of at least a dozen leaders as I walked it, it really defined how I thought about it. From the earliest leaders at a very senior level, I won't name by name, but their ability to internalize bad news and to have that be a learning moment for you, even if it was personally heavily impacting them, their ability to internalize that stress, I think, was extremely important. I remember one of my first leaders I'm describing as somebody that could put your head through a brick wall and you could be happy about it. And I took a lot away from that individual. He was very much able to center my thinking about how to think about the teams that I was facilitating and drawing things from, and how not to pass on my anxiety or even at times rage when things go wrong, but to remember that team's performance comes from you being able to accept both good and bad news equally and be that servant leader, help bring the best out of them.
What are some of the other leadership qualities or leadership insights and learning that you have acquired, especially in leading teams through times of stress, in changing market environments, when the market is going one way and then it turns around on you and everybody around is very stressed and under pressure, when perhaps you're failing to deliver what you aspire to deliver? What are some other key learnings about that?
So it's interesting when you think about it, when there are times of stress and change. I had a leader that what she taught me was directness and clarity in what you're communicating to people. So when you go through a stressful time, everyone knows that there are consequences and that there are risks for everybody in the room involved. When you're going through important transitions as a company, you have to be able to make it clear to people what the transition is, why it has to be done, and what are the potential consequences of it as you go through. And to make that really clear and transparent. You also have to learn how to make those consequences clearer at each level of what that means for the individual. If an individual is failing, that individual needs clarity. They need clarity on what's happening. They need the ability to escape and develop out of that. So you don't, I think one of the statements I learned early on was, don't bayonet the wounded. Your job is to help people develop out of times where they're having personal failure or personal need for transition. And you need to find a way to help develop them out of that, but also to provide clarity, to be able to give people the room to succeed and also the room to fail in a way that still maintains dignity in that situation. And I find that clarity for an organization, both on an individual and their personal behavior, in their personal work product, in an organization in the same way, when it's achieving or failing, to have clarity on where you stand in the current situation and what it takes to get to success as opposed to failure. And to me, that clarity and that openness and that trust that you have in people, that I can lay that situation out for you as it stands and not mask or shield things from you or surprise you, I think was extremely important.
The beauty in what you're describing is the relationship between openness, directness, and clarity of communication to dignity, where sometimes people will have the reverse instinct. I should protect the other person, and that way I will help them preserve their dignity. No, it's by being fully transparent and clear and factual, with care, with consideration, with support, with coaching. But it's there that you actually lift people up and offer them their sense of greater dignity.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important, especially when you think about the servant leadership. I think it's one of the hardest things about being a leader and developing an individual and developing an organization is you do need to give them the chance to understand the situation as it is, and it is very easy to shy away from that.
What are you working on in yourself at the moment as a leader, as a manager, as a professional?
It's an interesting one because I think it's it's a constant part of my journey, and it's been a part of the journey sort of at every step. It just evolves as you go through. I think that the first time I became a leader of people, that transition from being an individual contributor to being a leader of people is radical. It's radical because you're used to thinking about work product, not the emotions and the lives of the people that you're managing. And I think that shift is extremely important. But one of the things I learned early on was that, I almost described to the team as I had to cut off my access to data and had to more or less sort of tie my arms behind my back and make sure that I ask all questions through my team. So that I forced the teaching and forced the learning in a way that maybe wasn't the most efficient way for me personally, but developed a paradigm with my team where everything that came out of me came from them. And I think for me on a leadership journey, every layer looks like that, but it's a new challenge. It's almost like one day you're walking on the ground and the next day you're walking on stilts. And then you're walking on stilts on top of stilts, on top of stilts, on top of stilts.
Yeah.
You're so far from the ground and there's so many layers between you, and the balancing act between that becomes more intense. And your instinct at times as a leader can be when I'm afraid or when I think that things could be going wrong in the organization, I want to micromanage and go deep and assign accountability and rigor to everything. But actually, in general, what you should run counter to that instinct and constantly look to draw in the team, to draw the excellence out of them, to tie your hands behind your back and remember that anything good that comes from you has to come from that extended team. And the more that you have leadership layers between you and your teams, the more you have to constantly be conscious of how to do that and how to do that even down to the most junior members of the team when you can't have constant one-on-ones or constant dialogue. How do you propagate that spirit through your management layer and really have that full team reflect the best of what you and what the team have to offer and not the worst or simply only what you have to offer. You over constrain your team. So I think that's a challenge I work on at each layer, and it's certainly a developmental challenge for me now as I look at how do you lay out more on the extreme end of vision and strategy and not be so involved in the day-to-day execution that you deprive the team of its own creativity.
What I hear in this thought process that you offer is the self-insight, the self-awareness in terms of when do you actually need to work against your instinct. So many people thrive on following their instincts, and there are times to follow your instinct. But what you are describing are those moments where you actually feel pulled in the direction of micromanaging, and you have the self-insight, self-awareness to actually resist that pull and know that now you need to work exactly in the opposite direction to facilitate the kind of development and growth in your team. That can only happen if you have that internal dialogue as a leader in terms of what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What is it that I'm trying to achieve in the near term, but also in the long term with this a team of brilliant people? And how can I best use the crisis of the moment to address the immediate need, but also to use it as a learning opportunity in terms of who can we be tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. It's one of the things that you talked about. As a leader, you have the power to shape the conversation, and when you rely on your own intuition, I think it's important to use that and to use your experience to help shape and open up the conversation. But it's really important that you constantly evaluate and resist your own. They call it confirmation bias.
Yep.
That your own belief is right, and you look for supporting evidence that your belief is right. A team will quickly realize that you don't value their judgment, but they also look to you to spark the insight that it sort of forms like a seed crystal that the rest of the crystal forms around. And you really have to dance a fine line there as you're trying to figure out how to both encourage the right conversation, but not to over-define it in a way that you're the only one speaking. And that balance is really important to me, but it is a very hard one. You've been successful relying on your own intuition. It is extremely challenging to constantly remind yourself to allow the product to emerge from the team.
With all that you know today, Joe, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self?
So it's interesting when you look back and you think about where you're at 25. There's a lot of, I think, neuroses that comes from not quite knowing who you are yet. And I think one of the things that I would offer of advice to myself when I was starting out is to follow your passions, follow what you're good at in what you're doing, and really try to be excellent. And as you do that, allow your path to be a little bit more flexible. I think I heard it. I was at a leadership training recently where they were talking about a world famous chefs and how they approach their craft. They said that the worst thing that they can do is to start with a recipe and to go and try to find the ingredients that they need at the store for that recipe, because inevitably what you want is not there. There's going to be ingredients that you're missing, and then you have to go to more and more stores to try to find it. It's actually quite hard to get the job done that way. The better route is to actually look at what's available in your shelf and to start with that, to frame what you're going to make out of that, and then grab the one or two things you need in order to make that successful. And I think for me, starting out, what would have been more helpful is to realize that you really don't have to have a perfect design, and you don't have to have a perfect strategy, and you don't have to try to execute every mechanical detail to land exactly the way you want. What you need to do is actually look around at what's available to you and optimize it. Be an entrepreneur, take advantage of what you have, look to minimize your downside risk, but really look to take advantage of what you have and create an optimal outcome. And had I known that more, I think I would have approached the earlier stages of my career with a little bit more joy, I think.
That's a beautiful metaphor, and translated to the personal journey, it can offer the idea that most of the time, not everything, but most of the wisdom we need is right here, right now, nearby, if we can recognize it. And that's a powerful message.
Yeah.
If you were to lose all that you know and keep only 2 ideas or 2 capabilities or 2 practices, what would you keep?
I think one is certainly a reinforcement of what I just talked through, is that the collective power of your team, even when it doesn't follow your own inner instinct, is usually really powerful. And what you're able to leverage from them is a lot more than what you can generate internally. And so I think leveraging the collective power of your team, I think, is extremely important. The second thing that I think is really important is understanding who your, we almost overuse this metaphor, but who are your customers? Because in any environment, even, and I'm very much an internally focused corporate operative. The customer is not a part of my day-to-day experience, neither is designing the product per se. But what I have to do is I have to think of myself as a small business, and I have to think about who it is that I'm cultivating that needs the work product that I do, and how to make that my customer successful and make my product exceptional for them. And over time, as I've learned that, of how to think about that, not so much, again, as we talked about earlier, not the rigor of executing what you've been taught you're supposed to do within your function, but how to constantly be attuned to who is using your work product and why, and how to get better at that, I think, is extremely important. And if I looked at both those things, being attuned to my customer and being attuned to my team, I think those are the 2 things I would rely on more than anything.
Fascinating answer, and a fascinating exploration with you today, Joe. So as we bring this to landing, What parting wisdom do you want to offer to people listening to Create New Futures?
I think we've gone through quite a bit of it today of my baseline philosophy, I guess you'd call it. I think one of the things that's extremely important to me on the aspect of the customer itself is to continually push for something that's excellent and that only you can contribute. At times it's easy, and I watch this through athletic teams as I watch a lot of leaders try to think about how to optimize their salary and their salary cap, their portfolio, and optimizing it. In a lot of ways, it's easy to construct a team and easy to execute objectives in sort of a neutral, mediocre way. You can do that with a limited, with the same salaries, the same types of players. There's not much difference between them. It's essentially roughly the same work product. But there's something about pursuing excellence that causes everybody to be better, exceptional, take joy in their work, take pride in what they bring to the table. And to me, the motivating energy that being excellent brings to a team and brings to a process, I think, is extremely important. There's a life that gets sucked out of an organization when it's okay with mediocrity. And so I think even as I look at it from an analytical standpoint, and I will tell you early in my career, people used to say, nobody says they want to be a master scheduler when they grow up. I laugh at that now because I think there was a point in my career where I said, actually, if I knew now at 5 what I know now, I would have said I want to be a planner when I grow up. And you have to bring that urgency and that excellence to whatever it is that you do, whatever is in front of you. You have to really love it and you have to bring life to it. And the most exceptional people I work with that I seek out every day are people that sometimes have tasks that you would think are the most mundane tasks in the world that they perform at an extraordinary level. So I think if I was to give that one parting piece of advice, it would be to try to create something great. That's
awesome. The theme I've heard in what you're describing there, you're a scientist or a mathematician by training and by practice, but in your soul, you're an artist. You're looking after that intangible something else that is added to the work product, to the performance of the team, to what it is that we're looking to create, and that's more an art than a science.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me.
This has been awesome. Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Aviv.
Here we are. We've landed this Create New Futures journey, and it's your time to move into action, to create your new future. Here are a few steps you can take this week. First, Joe offered that servant leadership requires you to resist at times your instinct. For example, instead of micromanaging through crisis, build your team by drawing them in and by empowering them. Discover where you can be a servant leader this week by building your people and empowering them through struggle. Second, Joe describes his work as playing a game that he gets to play with people he appreciates and enjoys. There is a sense of liberation and an energy release when you apply yourself to your work through the lens of playing a game. How will you unleash such energy at work? How will you shape the game you play at work this week? Identify one such opportunity and apply yourself so you can learn by practicing. Here is a conversation you can create with your team. Ask them, what is the game we play? And then, how can we play at an even higher level? Third, Joe pointed that to build currency, you need to be transparent, to be a truth teller, and to not be defensive. Masquerading and or justifying and explaining is what we humans do when we feel threatened or at fault. But the teaching from Joe is that by confidently stepping up to take responsibility and by being analytical to the point of showing where and why your efforts failed, by demonstrating that courage, you're actually building currency and influence. Because you're showing people that they can trust you for your honesty and for your diligent debrief. Where do you have opportunities this week to build currency? How will you practice this kind of radical transparency? A transparency that builds everyone in who we are becoming as a team. There is a profound liberation you experience when you do not need to defend, and instead you are showing up data-driven and factual. One more thing, you can reach me directly by phone and on email to explore how we can help you and your team create your new future. See you next time.